Solomon Islands, August 7, 1942, 1300 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima led his squadron of 18 Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero fighters south from Rabaul at 20,000 feet. The afternoon sun glinting off their dark green paint as they escorted 27 Mitsubishi G4M bombers toward Guadalcanal, where American forces had just landed that morning to seize the airfield the Imperial Japanese Navy had been constructing for weeks, and Nakajima, veteran of the China campaign with 43 confirmed victories, felt the familiar surge of anticipation that came before combat, knowing his Zero fighters possessed superior maneuverability, superior climb rate, superior range, and pilots who had been flying combat missions since 1937, while the Americans flew their inferior Grumman F4F Wildcats that were heavier, slower, less maneuverable, and piloted by men who had never faced the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest warriors in aerial combat. The first sight of 8 American Wildcat fighters climbing from the USS Saratoga brought a slight smile to Nakajima's face, remembering how these same stubby American fighters had proven easy prey over the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and at Coral Sea just 3 months earlier, where his pilots had shot them down at will. The Wildcats, unable to match the Zero's ability to turn inside their radius, climb faster to gain altitude advantage, or escape once a skilled Japanese pilot locked onto their tail, and now these 8 American fighters were climbing to intercept, probably led by inexperienced pilots who still believed their heavier armor and 650 caliber machine guns could compensate for inferior performance. Nakajima waggled his wings to signal the attack, watching his pilots peel off in pairs to engage the American fighters, confident in the tactics that had brought victory after victory since December 7th at Pearl Harbor, where 328 Zero fighters had helped establish Japanese dominance across the Pacific, and he selected his target, a Wildcat that appeared to be the flight leader based on its position, beginning his attack run with the precision of a master swordsman, closing from above and behind at 331 miles per hour. His twin 20mm Type 99 cannons and dual 7.7mm machine guns ready to tear through the American fighter's armor. What happened next would haunt Nakajima for weeks afterward, becoming the subject of heated discussions in the ready rooms at Rabaul, because as he closed on the American fighter, lining up for what should have been an easy kill, the Wildcat suddenly turned hard toward another American fighter that was also under attack, the 2 planes crossing paths in what appeared to be a collision course, forcing Nakajima to pull up sharply to avoid the crossing aircraft. And suddenly, impossibly, he found himself with not 1 but 2 American fighters turning toward him, their 50 caliber machine guns already firing, tracers streaming past his canopy as he rolled desperately to escape. The maneuver made no sense according to everything Nakajima knew about aerial combat, violating the fundamental principle that a fighter under attack should turn away from danger to gain separation, not toward another fighter that was also engaged, creating what appeared to be chaos but was actually something far more dangerous, a coordinated defensive tactic that turned the hunters into the hunted, and Nakajima, twisting his Zero through a series of violent maneuvers that would have torn apart any American fighter, found himself unable to get a clean shot at either Wildcat as they continued their strange weaving pattern, each protecting the other's tail. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, flying as Nakajima's wingman with 64 victories to his credit, witnessed the entire engagement from above, later recording in his diary that for the first time since the war began, he watched his squadron commander forced to dive away from inferior American fighters, not because they had outflown him but because they had executed a tactical maneuver that neutralized every advantage the Zero possessed, its superior turn rate useless when the enemy refused to engage in a turning fight, its climb rate negated when the Americans maintained their altitude through coordinated weaving, and most disturbing of all, the tactics seemed designed specifically to counter the Zero's strengths. The battle over Guadalcanal continued for 25 minutes, with 18 Zero fighters unable to shoot down more than one of the 8 Wildcats, while losing 3 of their own to the coordinated defensive tactics of the Americans, including Lieutenant Junior Grade Yoshiyoshiga's Zero, which burst into flames when caught in the crossfire between 2 weaving Wildcats, the lack of armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks that had been sacrificed to achieve the Zero's remarkable performance now proving fatal when even a short burst from 50 caliber machine guns could ignite the aircraft. Back at Rabaul that evening, Nakajima stood before Admiral Yamamoto's staff, his face flushed with anger and humiliation as he described the new American tactic, his words coming in short, clipped sentences that barely contained his rage, explaining how two Wildcats working together had made it impossible to maintain an attack, how every attempt to get on one fighter's tail immediately exposed the attacker to fire from the wingman, how the Americans had somehow discovered a method to neutralize the advantages that Japanese pilots had spent years perfecting in China. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Japanese naval aviation community, because since the Type 0 carrier fighter had entered service in 1940, recording its first combat victories in China when 13 A6M2 Zeros shot down 27 Soviet-built I-16 and I-153 fighters in just 3 minutes without losing a single aircraft, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire Pacific strategy around the superiority of the Zero fighter, its ability to dominate any aerial battlefield, its range that allowed it to escort bombers on 1,000-mile missions, its maneuverability that no Allied fighter could match. The Mitsubishi factory workers in Nagoya who had built Nakajima's Zero, serial number 3148, had spent weeks crafting the aircraft with the devotion of temple builders, using the revolutionary extra super duralumin alloy developed by the Sumitomo Metal Company that was stronger and lighter than any aluminum alloy the Americans possessed, carefully drilling lightning holes wherever possible to reduce weight, eliminating armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks to achieve maximum performance, even etching Shinto blessings into the aircraft structure for divine protection, completing just one Zero fighter per day in September 1942 at the Mitsubishi plant. These workers, wearing their traditional Jikatabi split-toe sandals, applying thick coats of dark green paint to each completed Zero, had been told their aircraft were invincible, that American pilots flew heavy, sluggish fighters that could never match Japanese engineering brilliance, and the early months of the war had proven this true, with Zero pilots achieving a 12-to-1 kill ratio against Allied aircraft, making the Zero fighter the symbol of Japanese technological superiority and warrior spirit. The specifications told the story of why the Zero should have dominated every engagement with the Wildcat, weighing just 5,555 pounds fully loaded compared to the Wildcat's 7,426 pounds, giving it a power-to-weight ratio that translated into a climb rate of 3,000 meters in just 7 minutes and 1 second, while the heavier Wildcat needed almost 10 minutes to reach the same altitude, and in a turning fight at medium altitude, the Zero could complete a full circle while the Wildcat had only turned 2/3 of the way around. The Zero's Nakajima Sakae 21 engine, producing 1,130 horsepower, drove the fighter to 331 miles per hour, faster than the Wildcat's 318 miles per hour, while consuming fuel at a rate that gave it a combat range of over 1,200 miles with a drop tank, compared to the Wildcat's 770 miles, allowing Japanese pilots to fight over distant targets while American fighters were limited to defensive patrols near their carriers. These advantages had seemed insurmountable in the war's early months, when Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, reported that American fighter opposition was practically worthless, their tactics primitive, their pilots unable to match the skills of Japanese aviators who had been training since 1936, many with combat experience in China, where they had perfected their attacking techniques against Soviet and Chinese fighters. The Japanese Navy's fighter doctrine, developed at the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, emphasized individual combat skill and aggressive offensive tactics, with pilots trained to exploit the Zero's superior maneuverability in one-on-one dogfights, using the aircraft's exceptional turn rate to get on an enemy's tail and stay there until achieving a kill, a philosophy that had worked perfectly until that August afternoon over Guadalcanal. The man responsible for shattering Japanese confidence was Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thach, commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3 aboard USS Yorktown, who had spent months before the war studying intelligence reports about the Zero's capabilities. Working late into the night at his quarters in San Diego with matchsticks on his table, moving them like chess pieces to simulate aerial combat, searching for a way to counter an aircraft that was superior in every performance category. Thach had read the 22 September 1941 Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin describing the Zero's extraordinary maneuverability and climb rate, understanding that in a traditional dogfight, the Wildcat would lose every time, so instead of trying to match the Zero's strengths, he developed a tactic that would force Japanese pilots to fight on American terms, using teamwork and mutual support rather than individual skill. The tactic Thach developed, initially called beam defense position but soon known as the Thach weave, was deceptively simple in concept but required precise timing and absolute trust between wingmen, with two fighters flying side by side, roughly 2,000 feet apart, and when attacked, instead of both planes turning away or trying to outmaneuver the attacker individually, they would turn toward each other, crossing paths while the attacking Zero had to choose which target to follow. If the Zero followed one Wildcat through the turn, it would inevitably expose itself to the guns of the other Wildcat, creating a situation where the attacker became the target, and if the Zero tried to disengage, both Wildcats could reverse their turns and pursue, maintaining their mutual support while preventing the Japanese pilot from using his superior maneuverability to gain advantage. Thach had first tested the maneuver with Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare, who would later become the Navy's first ace, conducting mock combats where O'Hare led 4 Wildcats in simulated attacks while Thach's division practiced the weave, and after multiple engagements, O'Hare reported with excitement, "Skipper, it really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." The first combat test came at Midway on June 4, 1942, when Thach's division of 6 Wildcats, escorting Torpedo Squadron 8's obsolete Douglas TBD Devastators, was attacked by 15 to 20 Zeros from the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation, led by veterans who had fought at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and in the Indian Ocean. Ensign Robert Ram Dibb, flying as Thach's wingman for the first time in combat, heard Thach's calm voice over the radio, "Ram, help me out here." As a Zero locked onto Thach's tail, and Dibb turned hard toward his leader while Thach dove under him, the two Wildcats crossing paths as the pursuing Zero suddenly found itself facing Thach's 650 caliber machine guns, the Japanese pilot pulling up desperately as tracers filled the air where he had been. The Zero burst into flames, its unprotected fuel tanks igniting from just a few hits, demonstrating the fatal weakness of the Japanese design philosophy that had sacrificed everything for performance, and Thach watched the burning fighter spiral toward the ocean, knowing he had just proven that superior tactics could defeat superior aircraft, that American teamwork could overcome Japanese individual skill. Lieutenant Junior Grade Iozo Fujita, flying one of the Zeros from carrier Kaga, recorded in his diary that night, if he had survived, he would have written about the frustration of attacking the American fighters, how every time he achieved a favorable position on one Wildcat, another would appear from an unexpected angle, forcing him to break off his attack, how the Americans seemed to have developed a counter to every Japanese maneuver, how the inferior Wildcats had somehow become dangerous. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and 248 aircraft, but more importantly, it began the slow realization among Japanese pilots that the Zero's dominance was not absolute, that American pilots were learning, adapting, developing tactics that exploited weaknesses in the Zero that Japanese designers had never considered significant. The Zero's 20mm Type 99 cannons carried only 60 rounds per gun, giving pilots just 10 seconds of firing time, while the Wildcat's 650 caliber machine guns carried 240 rounds each, providing nearly 20 seconds of sustained fire, a difference that became critical in the prolonged engagements created by the Thach weave, where Japanese pilots often exhausted their cannon ammunition without achieving a kill. The lack of armor protection that had seemed acceptable when Zero pilots could avoid enemy fire through superior maneuverability became a fatal liability when the Thach weave forced them to fly through converging fields of fire, where even glancing hits from 50 caliber rounds could penetrate the pilot's seat, rupture fuel lines, or damage control cables, sending the lightweight fighter spinning out of control. The float-type carburetor in the Nakajima Sakai engine, which would starve of fuel during negative G maneuvers, limited the Zero's options when trying to escape the crossing patterns of the Thach weave, forcing pilots to roll inverted before diving, losing precious seconds while Wildcat pilots with pressure injection carburetors could push their noses down and dive immediately. Many Zero fighters in 1942 flew without radios to save weight, preventing pilots from coordinating their attacks or warning each other about threats, while American pilots used their radios constantly during the Thach weave, calling out targets, coordinating their movements, turning what appeared to be chaos into a carefully orchestrated defensive dance. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, returning to combat over Guadalcanal throughout August and September 1942, tried various tactics to defeat the Thach weave, including high-speed diving attacks, coordinated multiplane assaults, and attempts to separate the weaving fighters, but each time the Americans maintained their discipline, their mutual support, their refusal to be drawn into individual combat where the Zero's advantages would prove decisive. The Japanese Navy's fighter training program at Kasumigaura, which had produced the world's finest naval aviators, spending 2 years training each pilot in aerobatics, gunnery, and combat tactics, had never anticipated this kind of defensive fighting, where the enemy refused to engage in the honorable one-on-one combat that samurai tradition demanded, instead using teamwork and coordination to neutralize individual skill. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, studied after-action reports from Guadalcanal with growing concern, recognizing that the Americans had found a way to turn the Zero's strengths into weaknesses, that the very design philosophy of maximum performance through minimum weight had created vulnerabilities that coordinated tactics could exploit. The Nakajima Company, which had initially refused to bid on the Zero design because they thought the Navy's specifications were impossible to achieve, now produced more Zeros than Mitsubishi, manufacturing 6,570 aircraft compared to Mitsubishi's 3,879, but neither company could address the fundamental design limitations that the Thach weave exposed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, who had warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that I have utterly no confidence, watched the reports from Guadalcanal with deepening pessimism, understanding that if American pilots had found a way to defeat the Zero with inferior aircraft, what would happen when they received better fighters? The F6F Hellcat was already in development at Grumman's Bethpage, New York facility, designed specifically to counter the Zero based on intelligence gained from the captured Akutan Zero, which had crash-landed in the Aleutians in June 1942, giving American engineers their first opportunity to study the Japanese fighter's strengths and weaknesses in detail. The Hellcat would have everything the Zero lacked: armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, 650 caliber machine guns with abundant ammunition, and most importantly, a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that would give it superior speed and climb rate, making it unnecessary to use the Thach weave because American pilots could simply outfly their Japanese opponents. But in late 1942, the Hellcat was still months away from combat deployment, and the burden of holding the line fell on Wildcat pilots flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, where Marine Fighter Squadron 223 under Major John L. Smith and Marine Fighter Squadron 224 under Major Robert E. Gaylor used the Thach weave daily against Japanese raids from Rabaul. Captain Marion Carl of VMF 223, who would become the Marine Corps' first ace, described the effectiveness of the Thach weave in his after-action report, noting that Japanese pilots would often break off their attacks rather than pursue Wildcats through the weaving pattern, recognizing the trap and choosing to preserve their aircraft rather than risk destruction for an uncertain kill. The statistics from Guadalcanal told a story that shocked the Japanese high command, because by February 1943, when the Japanese evacuated the island, Wildcat pilots had achieved a 5.9 to 1 kill ratio against Zeros, a complete reversal from the early war period when Zeros had dominated every encounter, proving that tactics and teamwork could overcome performance advantages. Japanese pilot training, which had maintained its exceptional standards through 1942, began to deteriorate as experienced instructors were kept in combat units rather than rotated home to train replacements, and the new pilots arriving at Rabaul in early 1943 had less than half the flight hours of their predecessors, making them even more vulnerable to the disciplined teamwork of the Thach weave. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, who had survived the encounter with Thach's division at Midway, tried to teach younger pilots how to counter the American tactic, but found that it required a level of experience and situational awareness that novice aviators simply didn't possess, and many would panic when confronted with the crossing patterns of the weave, either colliding with wingmen or flying straight into American gunfire. The Zero production lines at Mitsubishi and Nakajima continued operating at maximum capacity, with workers putting in 12-hour shifts to build more fighters, but they were simply replacing losses rather than expanding the force, and each Zero required approximately 8,000 man-hours to construct, compared to the 5,000 man-hours needed for a Wildcat at Grumman or General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division. General Motors had taken over Wildcat production in early 1942, freeing Grumman to develop the Hellcat, and their Eastern Aircraft Division plants in Linden, Trenton, and Bloomfield, New Jersey, using automotive mass production techniques, would eventually build 5,837 FM Wildcats, demonstrating American industrial superiority that would prove as decisive as any tactical innovation. The German Luftwaffe, fighting its own desperate battle against American bombers over Europe, experienced similar frustrations when B-17 flying fortresses used mutually supporting defensive formations, their interlocking fields of fire creating the same kind of killing zones that the Thach we've produced on a smaller scale, proving that coordinated defensive tactics could neutralize attacking fighters regardless of nationality. Major Gerhard Barkhorn of Jagerschwader 52, with 301 victories on the Eastern Front, visited Japan in early 1943 as part of a technical exchange program, and after watching gun camera footage from Guadalcanal, commented that the Americans had developed a defensive tactic that turns the attacker's aggression against himself, comparing it to the frustration of attacking B-17 combat boxes. The Italian Regia Aeronautica, flying Macchi C-202 Folgore fighters in North Africa, encountered similar American tactics when P-40 Warhawks began using coordinated defensive maneuvers learned from the Pacific Theater, with Italian ace Adriano Visconti noting that American pilots had abandoned individual glory for collective survival, a concept foreign to the Italian fighter tradition. By October 1943, when the combined fleet launched Operation RO to reinforce Rabaul with carrier aircraft, the Thach weave had become standard doctrine throughout American naval aviation, taught at every training squadron, practiced until it became instinctive, turning what had been an improvised defensive maneuver into a fundamental part of American fighter tactics. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanamizu, leading 48 Zeros from carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Zuho to Rabaul, found that even the newest American pilots were executing the Thach weave with precision, their coordination so exact that attacking them was like trying to grab smoke, always seeming solid until you reached for it, then dissipating into nothing. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound, because they had been trained from their first days at Kasumigaura to believe in the superiority of Japanese spirit, that their willing acceptance of death in unarmored aircraft demonstrated a warrior's courage that soft Americans could never match. Yet these same Americans had found a way to make courage irrelevant through superior tactics. Commander Masateko Kumiya, serving on Admiral Takeo Kurita's staff, wrote in his private journal that the Thach weave represented a fundamental challenge to our conception of aerial warfare, forcing Japanese pilots to abandon everything they had been taught about honor and individual combat, reducing them to frustrated spectators of their own impotence. The Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 32, introduced in April 1942 with a more powerful Sakao A21 engine and clipped wings for faster roll rate, was specifically designed to counter American tactics, but pilots found that the reduced wingspan decreased maneuverability without providing enough additional speed to overcome coordinated defensive tactics, and only 343 were built before production switched to the Model 22. The Model 52, which began production in summer 1943, incorporated heavier gauge wing skins to allow higher diving speeds, individual exhaust stacks for additional thrust, and improved armor protection. But these modifications increased weight to the point where the Zero's legendary maneuverability was compromised, making it even more vulnerable to the Thach weave's crossing patterns. Nakajima test pilot Katsuzo Shima, evaluating the Model 52 prototype, reported that the aircraft had lost the spirit of the Zero, no longer possessing the ethereal lightness that had made it such a formidable dogfighter, becoming instead a compromised design that satisfied no one, neither fast enough to run from danger nor agile enough to dance through it. The factory workers at Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant, who had once etched blessings into each Zero structure, now found themselves building aircraft they knew were inferior to the American fighters beginning to appear over Japan itself, the Boeing B-29 Superfortresses escorted by P-51 Mustangs that could outrun, outclimb, and outfight any Zero variant. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, who had scored 27 victories flying Zeros, tested captured Wildcat and Hellcat fighters in late 1943, reporting to Naval General Staff that American aircraft were built for war, not for show, with armor, self-sealing tanks, and redundant systems that allowed them to absorb tremendous punishment while their pilots remained focused on the mission. The Thach weave had proven so effective that variations were developed for different situations, including the loose deuce formation where two fighters operated independently but within supporting distance, the double attack where four fighters wove in two separate pairs, and the vertical weave, where the crossing patterns included altitude changes to complicate deflection shooting. Marine Captain Joe Foss of VMF 121, who would score 26 victories at Guadalcanal, credited the Thach weave with saving his life multiple times, describing one engagement where 6 Zeros attacked his two-plane section, but after 5 minutes of weaving, the Japanese pilots withdrew without scoring a single hit, their frustration evident in their sloppy disengagement. The Japanese Navy's attempt to counter the Thach weave through numerical superiority, sending larger formations to overwhelm the weaving fighters, failed because American pilots simply expanded their patterns to accommodate more aircraft, with entire squadrons executing coordinated weaves that created overlapping fields of fire no attacker could penetrate safely. Lieutenant Commander Yasuna Kazono, commanding the 253rd Air Group at Rabaul, tried training his pilots in a similar mutual support tactic, but found that it contradicted everything they had learned about aerial combat, their instincts still driving them toward individual glory rather than collective survival, and most abandoned the tactic under the stress of combat. The arrival of the F-6F Hellcat in late 1943 marked the end of any Japanese hope of regaining aerial superiority, because American pilots no longer needed the Thach weave to survive. They could simply outfly their opponents in every dimension, but the tactic remained in the training syllabus as insurance against future enemies with superior aircraft. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American pilots shot down 395 Japanese aircraft while losing only 29, a 13-to-1 kill ratio that demonstrated the complete reversal of fortunes since the war's early days, with many Japanese pilots now flying their first combat mission against Americans with thousands of hours of experience. The Thach we've had applications beyond fighter combat, with torpedo bomber crews using similar mutual support tactics to defend against fighter attacks, and even B-29 crews over Japan employed coordinated defensive maneuvers inspired by the original fighter tactic, proving that the principle of mutual support transcended specific aircraft types. Admiral Somu Toyota, who succeeded Yamamoto after his death in April 1943, acknowledged in a post-war interview that the Thach weave had been the beginning of the end for Japanese naval aviation, the moment when technological superiority was proven insufficient against superior tactics, when the warrior spirit met its match in American pragmatism. The final indignity came when Japanese pilots began adopting the Thach weave themselves in late 1944, desperately trying to survive against overwhelming American numbers, but by then most lacked the radio equipment and training to execute it properly, their attempts at coordination dissolving into chaos at the first sign of combat. Commander Yoshimori Terai, who had trained many of Japan's best fighter pilots before the war, watched his former students die one after another, victims of a tactical innovation that had turned their greatest strength into their greatest weakness, their willingness to engage in close combat becoming a fatal trap when the enemy refused to fight on those terms. The Mitsubishi factory at Nagoya was bombed repeatedly by B-29s in late 1944 and early 1945, the workers who had once built Zeros with religious devotion now cowering in shelters as American bombs destroyed their production lines, the final proof that tactical innovation and industrial might had trumped the samurai spirit. Zero production continued until August 1945 with 10,815 aircraft built in total, but the last examples were reserved for kamikaze missions, their pilots knowing they would never return, the ultimate acknowledgement that conventional fighter tactics had failed, that the only remaining option was self-destruction. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who had first encountered the Thach weave over Guadalcanal, survived the war and later admitted that the tactic had broken the spell of the Zero's invincibility, forcing Japanese pilots to confront the reality that courage alone could not overcome intelligent tactical innovation, that the Americans had found a simple solution to what had seemed an impossible problem. The Thach weave influenced military aviation doctrine worldwide, demonstrating that technological superiority could be neutralized through tactical innovation, that teamwork could overcome individual skill, that disciplined execution of simple concepts could defeat complex attack patterns, lessons that would resonate through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. John Thach himself, promoted to captain and later admiral, never claimed his tactic won the Pacific Air War single-handedly, but acknowledged that it gave American pilots the confidence to engage superior enemy aircraft, knowing they had a defensive system that worked, a foundation upon which more aggressive tactics could be built as better aircraft became available. The workers at General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division, who had transitioned from building cars to building Wildcats, took pride in knowing their aircraft had held the line during the critical months of 1942 and early 1943, when the Thach weave and the F4F were all that stood between Japanese dominance and American survival. In the final analysis, the Thach weave represented everything the Pacific War would become, a conflict where American industrial capacity, technological adaptation, and tactical flexibility would overcome Japanese skill, dedication, and initial advantages, where simple solutions would defeat complex problems, where teamwork would triumph over individual excellence. The tactic's elegance lay in its simplicity, two aircraft turning toward each other when attacked, creating mutual support through coordinated movement, requiring no special equipment, no superior performance, just trust between wingmen and the discipline to maintain the pattern even when every instinct screamed to break away and run. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's greatest surviving ace with 64 victories, wrote in his post-war memoir that the Thach weave had been a mirror that showed us our own weaknesses, forcing Japanese pilots to recognize that their entire approach to aerial combat had been based on the assumption that enemies would fight on Japanese terms, an assumption that cost thousands of lives. The psychological impact extended beyond the pilots themselves to the entire Japanese naval establishment, which had built its strategy around the mobile carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, protected by Zero fighters that were supposed to sweep enemy aircraft from the skies, only to watch those same Zeros neutralized by a defensive tactic developed by one American officer working with matchsticks on a table. The irony was that the Thach weave worked precisely because it abandoned traditional fighter tactics, refusing to engage in the turning battles where the Zero excelled, instead creating a new paradigm where defense became offense, where survival through mutual support took precedence over achieving individual victories, where patience and discipline mattered more than aggressive spirit. By war's end, the kill ratio between American fighters and Zeros had reached nearly 12-1 in America's favor, a complete reversal from the 12-1 ratio Japan had enjoyed in the war's early months, with the Thach weave serving as the turning point, the moment when American pilots learned they could not just survive but prevail against their seemingly invincible opponents. The last Zero victory against an American fighter occurred on August 14, 1945, one day before Japan's surrender, when Warrant Officer Iwao Hatakanaka shot down a consolidated PB-4Y Liberator, a hollow victory that meant nothing in the face of total defeat, the Zero's war ending not with glory but with the realization that superior tactics had rendered superior aircraft irrelevant. Today, the Thach weave is still taught at the Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, not because modern fighters need defensive tactics against superior enemies, but because the principle it represents, that intelligent tactical innovation can overcome technological disadvantage, remains as relevant in the age of stealth fighters and beyond visual range missiles as it was when Wildcats faced Zeros over Guadalcanal. The memorial at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo includes the names of many Zero pilots who died facing the Thach weave, young men who had believed themselves invincible until they encountered a simple tactical innovation that turned their advantages against them, their deaths a testament to the danger of assuming superiority based on technology alone. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima's final report, written after the war for American intelligence officers, concluded with a simple statement that captured the essence of Japan's defeat in the air. "We believed the Zero made us invincible, but the Americans proved that tactics make the pilot, not the plane. An admission that the simple Thach we've had indeed beaten the mighty Zero."